At 4:22 a.m., Chicago didn't wait. It vanished. Lake fog smothered the skyline until even River North dissolved into a gray void. But one light still burned above it all, the Riverton Tower penthouse, Congressman Victor Alejandro Mercer's gleaming shrine to himself. Glass walls, curated art, a perfect television backdrop for the man who sold himself as Illinois' future. In minutes, it would all be ripped open. For months, a ghost signal pulsed through federal servers, encrypted bursts bouncing from Guatemala, from Sonora, and then, impossibly, from the heart of downtown Chicago. The circle tightened. The source? Mercer's penthouse. Surveillance teams followed his midnight movements like hunters tracking a wounded predator. Unmarked cars slipping into alleys, quiet stops near half-dead industrial zones, unexplained entries into restricted freight yards. Then the messages surfaced. Regulatory cover, disguised shipments, political protection, red lines south, each stamped with Los Serranos' internal codes. Mercer wasn't helping the cartel. He was the cartel. At 4:26 a.m., the hammer dropped. The elevator system locked, power rerouted. A breaching ram hissed, and the penthouse door exploded inward with a concussion that shook the glass walls like thunder. In a single blast, the illusion that Chicago's polished, camera-ready congressman was anything but a cartel architect died on the floor he designed to impress the world. Agents swept through the penthouse with silent precision. The space was immaculate, almost theatrically clean. But behind every panel, behind every minimalist surface, the second life Mercer had hidden for 13 years crawled into view. The first discovery came behind a sliding wood panel near the kitchen, an armored door disguised as wine storage. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. A refrigerated chamber stretched across the width of the building, lined with stainless steel vaults, labeled with Spanish shorthand, used exclusively by Los Serranos chemists. Each vault contained tightly wrapped chemical bricks, precursor powders, solvent canisters, and drying agents. Some barrels were still warm, evidence of processing within the last 12 hours. Adjacent to the vault stood a row of modular crates, each open to reveal stacks of cash bound with color-coded straps. $14.6 million in total, sorted by region. Beneath these sat sealed bullion tubes containing gold coins minted in Mexico, Peru, and Panama. A false floor panel concealed a thin aluminum case filled with microchips and burner phones, linked to nodes across Pilsen, Little Village, Cicero, and Hammond. This wasn't storage, it was logistics, a command cell, a central distribution artery hidden in the heart of Chicago. But the discovery that froze even the most seasoned agents was found in the office, Mercer's signature room, where he conducted remote interviews framed by the Chicago skyline. On his desk, illuminated by the jittery reflection of police strobes below, sat an encrypted tablet still unlocked. A cascade of messages filled the screen in real time. Confirmation codes for incoming shipments through Calumet Harbor, reroutes through Joliet rail hubs, coordination notes with Los Serranos lieutenants operating out of Puebla and Tapachula. Several messages bore timestamps identical to congressional hearing recesses. Others referenced political leverage, committee influence, and disguised federal amendments designed to loosen cargo inspections across the Midwest. Mercer had not simply been covering up cartel operations. He had engineered their expansion. The digital folder structure on his device only darkened the picture. One folder, titled Southworks Plan, contained schematics for an underground complex hidden beneath an abandoned steel facility along the Southern River Corridor. The blueprints revealed industrial-grade ventilation, reinforced corridors, subterranean labs, and patrol routes. Satellite overlays pinpointed a massive thermal anomaly beneath the decaying factory shells. A red-marked note in Mercer's handwriting read simply, "Primary node, no interruptions." Analysts instantly recognized the location, South Deering, a sprawling post-industrial maze of rusted steel, broken brick, and empty lots where old Chicago industry once thrived. Now it hid something much darker. As agents continued sweeping the penthouse, another layer of Mercer's deception surfaced. Behind the bathroom mirror, a concealed biometric lock opened to reveal a slender server rack humming with quiet menace. Hard drives pulsed behind reinforced casing. Their mirrored configuration suggested redundancy, critical data stored in multiple encrypted bands. OneDrive was still in sync when agents accessed the interface. It uploaded live telemetry from a network of safe houses scattered across Cook County. Red pings marked active hubs in Brighton Park, Uptown, West Ridge, and 2 locations in the Loop. The pattern was unmistakable. Mercer had constructed a web of micronodes, linking Los Serranos operations across the city, and the congressman himself had been the architect. When they finally extracted Mercer from his bedroom, calm, freshly awake, wearing the quiet expression of a man long accustomed to controlling narratives, the facade of respectability was already gone. He did not ask why agents were there. He did not protest. He simply stared at the floor, as if realizing the world he built beneath Chicago had collapsed in on itself. By 4:41 a.m., the penthouse was secure. Evidence boxes filled with contraband, chemicals, cash, gold, weapons, encrypted devices were carried out past the mirrored lobby where Mercer had greeted journalists dozens of times. Outside, the city was still dark, the river still wrapped in fog, the skyscrapers still silent. Chicago had no idea that one of its most celebrated political figures had been feeding an international cartel for more than a decade. But across a dozen federal screens, one word flashed repeatedly in Mercer's seized files: Steel Veil. It was the code name for the South Deering complex. And as dawn crept over the Chicago River, the mission shifted instantly. The congressman had fallen. Now the fortress he protected had to fall next. For most of Chicago, Congressman Victor Alejandro Mercer was the polished one, the urbane reformer who spoke about rebuilding the South Side economy with a confidence that soothed voters battered by decades of political failure. He appeared nightly on local news stations, leaning forward with empathetic gravity as he talked about industrial revitalization, cleaner infrastructure, and protecting immigrant communities from predatory policing. The city loved that version of him. He was a bridge between the old Chicago machine and a new, modern Midwest political identity. But every camera he stood in front of, every ribbon cutting he attended, every speech he delivered about transparency, those were props placed carefully to hide the machinery operating underneath. Mercer didn't rise through charisma or civic goodwill. He rose because Los Serranos needed a voice in Congress who could bend Chicago's arteries of freight, cargo, and chemical movement without ever drawing suspicion. The first signs of his double life were buried in the financial dust of 2011. Tiny donations from anonymous LLCs anchored in Little Village, accounts tied to shuttered taquerias and demolition companies that hadn't operated in years. At the time, the sums were small. But when investigators later layered those transactions against DEA seizure logs, train yard manifests, and unusual activity in freight corridors, a pattern took shape. Each deposit matched a shipment that passed through Intermodal Rail Terminal 47th Street, or the massive Belt Railway junction in Clearing. When seizures occurred, only partial loads were intercepted. The missing halves weren't vanishing. They were moving silently into the city through warehouses leased by shell companies tied directly to Mercer's earliest campaign contributors. By his second term, the architecture grew more sophisticated. Mercer established 8 nonprofit organizations across Chicago, community initiatives focused on homelessness, youth mobility, green redevelopment. Not a single one conducted noticeable programs. Instead, they served as financial reservoirs through which tens of millions of cartel funds flowed. Their tax filings listed vague consulting expenses and infrastructure audits, but when investigators later analyzed them, none had payroll records or office leases. They existed only as digital shells. These shells routed money through Chinatown wholesalers, Bridgeport construction fronts, suburban holding companies in Naperville, and real estate trusts hidden behind law firms on LaSalle Street. Each movement laundered another fraction of Los Serranos' revenue under the glow of civic virtue. But Mercer's most valuable asset to the cartel came not from money laundering, it came from influence. Through strategic committee placements, he gained a hand in shaping oversight on rail, port logistics, customs acceleration, and hazardous materials regulation. He pushed amendments buried deep inside federal bills, lines of technical jargon invisible to the public, a sentence modifying inspection timing at Calumet Harbor, a nuance in chemical transport rules allowing certain industrial solvent blends to move without secondary checks, a clause expanding exemptions for private freight contractors on the South Branch of the Chicago River. Each change was subtle, none made headlines, But everyone widened the artery through which Los Serranos pushed their product into the Midwest. His travel logs held another layer of deception. He frequently scheduled community assessments in districts that had no ongoing federal programs. He visited abandoned warehouses in back of the yards, claiming interest in redevelopment. He toured broken industrial lots near the steel mills of South Chicago, posing for photos while staffers stayed behind. He took midnight charter flights from Midway under the guise of regional economic research. Those planes flew not to policy hubs, but to obscure airfields near Laredo, Tucson, and Brownsville, border cities where Los Serranos maintained covert relay systems. The flight durations, fuel logs, and landing times later showed that Mercer used those trips not to discuss governance, but to negotiate production quotas, shipping calendars, and territorial expansion across the Midwest. When federal analysts unlocked his encrypted storage during the River North raid, the full scope of his parallel life finally unfurled. Thousands of documents filled the screen, shipment routes disguised as infrastructure plans, political endorsements purchased through covert transfers, maps marked with cryptic initials that investigators matched to safe houses across Cook County. The deeper they dug, the darker the lattice became. One folder titled Harbor 9 contained satellite images of clusters of cargo containers positioned in formation at Calumet Harbor. These weren't standard stacks. They were arranged to form an insulated corridor, shielding chemical barrels from drone heat scans. Another folder cataloged chemical orders placed under the name of a dissolved Bridgeport cleaning business. Each order corresponded to precursor compounds used by Los Serranos to synthesize high-yield opioids. But the most chilling discovery, the one that rewrote the course of the investigation, was a set of architectural diagrams titled Project Steel Veil. When analysts opened the files, the room fell silent. The blueprints depicted a massive subterranean complex built beneath an abandoned steel processing shell in South Deering. On the surface, the facility looked like one of the many forgotten ruins scattered along the Calumet River. Rusted beams, shattered windows, vegetation choking old conveyor belts. But the diagrams revealed an entirely different reality beneath the decayed skin. 3 underground levels, industrial ventilation grids, reinforced hallways, chemical labs, dormitories for captive workers, armories stocked with imported weapons, server rooms designed to run cold to avoid thermal detection, an escape tunnel leading to a false drainage channel connected to the river. It was a cartel city beneath the industrial corpse of old Chicago steel. The deeper files showed exactly how Mercer maintained the illusion. The land was owned by South Minerals and Fabrication, a corporation dissolved in 1996. Yet every year, small but consistent legal motions were filed under its name by a downtown firm that never appeared on public rosters. Utilities were routed through abandoned conduits mislabeled as inactive. Property taxes were processed through a ghost account that vanished into a web of bank transfers. Not a single alert had been triggered in 27 years. There were voice memos, too, recordings Mercer never expected anyone to hear. His voice was calm, rehearsed, stripped of the empathy he used in public. He spoke of optimizing throughput, maintaining political buffer, and expanding Western distribution. He never used the words cartel, narcotics, or trafficking. He didn't need to. His phrasing matched the private operational lexicon of Los Serranos. In one memo, he referenced 40 retained workers, the exact euphemism Sierra Caliente had used in iron timber, a term meaning captive laborers trapped inside underground facilities. Another memo mentioned production stability and winter adjustments, an indication that the underground lab was active year-round. The final memo, recorded 5 days before the raid, was the most revealing. Southworks stays online at all costs. If inspections shift, adjust the blending schedule and expand third-tier storage. Do not stall distribution. Veil integrity is more important than external turbulence. Those words sealed the decision. Steel Veil was the operational heart of Los Serranos in Chicago. If it remained active, the network would regenerate even with Mercer in custody. The facility had to fall, and soon. Within minutes, federal teams pivoted. Tactical maps were drawn. Recon drones deployed. Quiet coordination began between FBI HRT, DEA SRT, and DHS tactical branches. South Deering's rusted skyline framed the coming operation. Hidden beneath those skeletal steel towers was the largest cartel fortress the Midwest had ever seen, one built with congressional protection, fed by Chicago's freight arteries, and shielded by a man who had convinced millions he was fighting for them. Taking down Mercer had been the first fracture. Taking down Steel Vale would determine whether the entire empire survived another day. The first drone feed of the Steel Vale complex came in at 2:14 a.m., a grainy thermal silhouette bleeding through the darkness over South Deering. To anyone unfamiliar with Chicago's industrial graveyards, the site looked like just another abandoned steel mill. Rusted conveyor arms, collapsed furnaces, skeletal catwalks looming over the Calumet River like the bones of a dead factory town. But the thermal patterns told a different story. Beneath the decayed metal lay a massive heat signature, rectangular and pulsing, with industrial-grade ventilation grids exhaling warm air through disguised exhaust stacks. The layout was too symmetric, too active, too alive. It wasn't abandonment, it was camouflage. And the Congressman's encrypted blueprints had been accurate. Somewhere below that wasted shell was a fully operational cartel fortress. By 2:38 a.m., tactical convoys rolled into the industrial belt from three sides, their engines muted behind sound baffling and the thick fog curling off the river. The cold had frozen the ground into a brittle crust that snapped quietly under heavy boots. Above them, a low layer of cloud reflected the amber glow of distant city lights, giving the night air a strange metallic sheen. The rusted fences, the leaning smokestacks, the hollow rail spurs, they formed a kind of haunted labyrinth perfect for concealing something monumental. And inside that labyrinth, federal teams advanced through narrow service corridors, old cable trenches, and the skeletons of loading bays that hadn't moved steel in decades. Aerial scans identified the patrol routes first. 6 armed pairs circled the upper property in a staggered pattern, each wearing thermal-resistant gear, mercenaries, not street soldiers. Infrared picked up heavier clusters deeper underground, nearly 50 heat signatures moving in coordinated paths through long hallways beneath the mill. Surveillance analysts counted at least 40 slow, irregular human signatures, likely the captive labor force Mercer referenced in his memos. Everything matched Los Serranos' operational blueprint. Cheap labor kept in hidden industrial cells, guarded by hybrid teams of cartel enforcers, and hired contractors brought north from Guatemala and Honduras. The teams moved into final positions by 3:01 a.m., forming a three-pronged assault axis. FBI hostage rescue team would engage from the east, cutting through an underground conveyor shaft disguised as a collapsed chute. DEA SRT would breach from the west supply tunnel, a forgotten freight channel buried under concrete slabs. DHS tactical teams would neutralize the outdoor patrols and seal off escape routes along the river. A specialized electronic warfare unit prepared the broad-spectrum jammer, timed to hit the complex at the exact moment breaching charges detonated. Everything depended on synchronized shock. Blind them, isolate them, then take the underground levels before Los Serranos could burn evidence or trigger solvent destruction protocols. At 3:10 a.m., the jammer activated. A wideband crackle rippled through the air, invisible but devastating. Radios inside the complex died instantly. Surveillance cams flashed static, then blacked out. The guards on the surface reacted in confusion, tapping dead earpieces, turning in circles, searching for a threat they couldn't see. They never noticed the silhouettes emerging from the shadows behind them. In seconds, the outer perimeter fell. Silent, clean, surgical. The pathway to Steel Vale's underbelly was open. 3 seconds later, the first breach erupted. An orchestrated series of explosions blew through the sealed conveyor slab on the east side. Chunks of concrete and rusted steel collapsed inward, opening a vertical cavity into the service shaft below. Agents descended fast, boots clanging against the ladder rungs. The shaft was narrow and hot, lit by emergency guide lights pulsing red. At its base was a graded landing overlooking a long corridor, lined with pipes vibrating from industrial airflow. 2 cartel guards stood at the far end, rifles slung but unready. They were still trying to understand why the alarms hadn't triggered. They never had time to raise their weapons. On the west side, DEA agents sliced through a steel hatch covered in decades of soot. Once breached, the tunnel revealed a false wall leading to a processing wing glowing white with harsh fluorescent light. Inside were 4 chemical mixers, each churning thick, viscous compounds. Workers in stained coveralls labored under the supervision of armed men perched above on catwalks. The blast of the breach drowned out every other sound. Smoke poured in. Guards turned toward the noise, firing blindly, but their rounds sparked uselessly off the reinforced corner as the agents surged forward. In seconds, the upper platform was secured, the workers pulled behind cover, and the first processing hall fell under federal control. Then the fighting intensified. The deeper teams advanced, the more the facility revealed its true nature. Steel Vale wasn't a basement lab. It was a subterranean campus. 3 levels threaded through old industrial foundations. Long corridors reinforced with modern concrete, sealed storage rooms filled with chemical drums, armored doors with biometric locks registered to cartel lieutenants, and ventilation chambers large enough to cool continuous production cycles. Every turn presented new choke points. Every corner was a kill zone. Cartel defenders attempted to use the layout to their advantage, retreating from hallway to hallway, trying to regroup near the central control hub. But the federal teams moved like a machine. HRT advanced with a tight cadence. Clear, move, anchor, push. DEA SRT held the midline, covering stairwells and extraction paths. DHS units pressed inward from the riverside, cutting off potential escape routes through maintenance tunnels. The echo of gunfire bounced through steel corridors. Short bursts, tight shots, controlled impacts. Sparks jumped from railings. Fragments of concrete flecked the air. The smell of hot metal mixed with chemical fumes rising from cracked containers. At 3:22 a.m., the cartel attempted their final defense. A reinforced blast door sealed the entry to the western control chamber, where a group of 15 mercenaries had gathered around the facility's master console. From behind the barrier, they fired through narrow slits, pinning down the approaching teams. But they underestimated the breach unit. A linear charge was placed along the frame. The hallway shook with a gut punch blast. The door peeled like a torn hinge, screeching open as smoke flooded the chamber. The defenders tried to reposition, but the tactical sweep was overwhelming. 20 seconds of chaos, then silence. With the control room secured, Steel Vale collapsed. Lights flickered, then steadied. Generators whined down. The hum of mixers dulled. Doors groaned open as power rerouted. Federal teams pushed into the deepest hall, where they found the 40 captive laborers, exhausted, chemically burned, some barely conscious. The conditions were brutal: mattresses on concrete, toxic residue on walls, heat vents pumping recycled air thick with fumes. When the workers saw the uniforms, some wept openly. Others simply stared, numb, as medics rushed to stabilize them. Evidence extraction began immediately. The magnitude was staggering. Over 900 kilograms of high-purity synthetic product, massive racks of precursor chemicals stored in climate-controlled lockers, an arsenal of rifles, pistols, and shotguns packed in crates stamped with Los Serranos insignia, and in a server room cooled to near freezing, investigators found the heart of the network. Racks of hardened drives containing shipment data, financial ledgers, political contacts, safe house inventories, and coded communications. Steel Vale had been designed not just as a production hub, but as an administrative nerve center for the cartel's Midwest expansion. By 3:46 a.m., Federal Command confirmed full control of the facility. The underground fortress, built in secret beneath a dead industrial sector, protected by a sitting congressman, was finished. Smoke drifted through the broken corridors. Emergency lights blinked in weak patterns. The old mill above stood silent again, as though the past 2 decades of hidden activity had been wiped clean in less than half an hour. But the operation's leaders all felt the same cold truth as they stood among the wreckage. Destroying Steel Vale wouldn't end the fight. It would ignite the largest crackdown Chicago had seen in decades. Because once a network this woven into the city was exposed, every node connected to it would either collapse or lash out in desperation. And that collapse was already spreading across Cook County like a fuse. The moment Steel Vale fell, the shockwave tore across Chicago's criminal and political landscape with the force of a ruptured boiler tank. Within minutes of full containment being confirmed, federal analysts flooded the command center with the first decrypted fragments of data ripped from the underground servers. The picture that formed was not a network in the simple sense. It was a lattice of corruption woven through the bones of the city itself. safe houses embedded in family-owned businesses, laboratories shielded by zoning loopholes, political allies hidden inside municipal agencies, forwarding nodes in Cicero, Aurora, and Waukegan, financial runners embedded in construction unions and community nonprofits. Everything Congressman Mercer had built was not an auxiliary extension of Los Serranos. It was the cartel's Midwest backbone. And with its central artery severed beneath South Deering, the entire structure began to buckle. Operation Crimson Sweep launched at 9:11 a.m., striking the first target before the sun burned through the industrial haze drifting over the city. In Pilsen, federal teams breached a 3-story brick building that posed as a neighborhood logistics firm. Inside, they found 4 Los Serranos accountants racing to erase hard drives and ignite solvent barrels. The agents stopped them seconds before detonation. Behind a false drywall section sat crates filled with $8.4 million in shrink-wrapped currency and ledgers listing dozens of Chicago businesses Mercer had quietly funneled cartel funds through. Half a mile north, a quiet taqueria on 18th Street was revealed to be a covert stash point, its basement lined with steel lockers containing precursor powders disguised as imported masa flour bags. At nearly the same moment, the western corridor lit up. In Cicero, a commercial cold storage facility was breached by DEA SRT. Inside, fog billowed out of industrial refrigeration lines as agents uncovered hundreds of vacuum-sealed packages hidden behind crates of produce. 2 armed guards attempted to escape through a loading dock, but were intercepted by DHS units blocking the alley. In Aurora, a ranch-style home sitting on a peaceful cul-de-sac concealed a micro-lab under its garage floor. When agents opened the hidden hatch, a blast of chemical fumes poured out. The lab was still warm. Records showed nightly shipments heading straight toward Joliet freight yards, shipments coordinated by Mercer's committee modifications. But the operation was far from quiet everywhere. The most violent engagement occurred in a stretch of rusting industrial land near the Sanitary and Ship Canal. A convoy of cartel vehicles fled a raided storage facility, speeding toward I-55. State troopers deployed spike strips, but the convoy swerved onto a service road heading east. A firefight erupted as federal units boxed the vehicles in between a wall of derelict silos. Gunfire cracked across the concrete ruins. Sparks rained from metal siding. When it ended, 5 operatives were in custody, and agents recovered crates of weapons set for redistribution across Cook County. By midday, Crimson Sweep surged north into the Lakeshore Arc. In Waukegan, ATF agents raided a steel fabrication shop that had been dark for years but still paid utilities, an immediate red flag. Inside, they found modified carbines, suppressed pistols, and a small shipment of ceramic weapon components intended to move undetected through metal detectors. Each weapon matched serial patterns used by Los Serranos enforcers. In Rogers Park, a community wellness center, one Mercer had publicly praised, contained a locked back room where cartel tech specialists maintained encrypted routers linking Chicago's safe houses to international command nodes. Calumet Harbor became the next front. From the air, federal helicopters spotted a series of cargo containers arranged in suspicious geometric patterns, almost identical to the formations seen in Mercer's digital files. When agents breached the containers, they discovered insulated corridors hiding barrels of chemical precursors and smuggling documents printed with forged federal seals. One container revealed an armored crate of rifles shipped through an alias owned by an old friend of Mercer's, a political donor who claimed for years he didn't involve himself in the congressman's business. His involvement was now undeniable. In the midst of the raids, the arrest roster swelled by the hour. 15 safe houses down, 7 laboratories dismantled, nearly 100 operatives detained. But the political side of the collapse was only beginning. As news networks broke the story, Congressman Mercer ran cartel network beneath Chicago. The city erupted. Crowds gathered outside his old campaign office in Logan Square. Protesters marched down State Street, waving signs demanding resignations across every agency that had failed to notice his rise. Elderly residents from South Shore, many of whom once applauded Mercer's promises to restore abandoned factories, stood trembling with disbelief. Spanish-speaking families from Little Village and Gage Park expressed rage that a man claiming to defend immigrant communities had secretly enabled a cartel that preyed on them. Within 48 hours, a list began circulating internally among federal agencies. 23 individuals under investigation for aiding Mercer's operations, zoning officials who expedited suspicious permits, bank managers who approved irregular money transfers, a police sergeant who dismissed repeated traffic stop anomalies tied to cartel couriers, a city procurement officer who diverted industrial equipment to a shell company later found inside Steel Vale. The political machine around Mercer, whether knowingly or through negligence, had become part of the infrastructure that kept the cartel alive. But perhaps the most heartbreaking revelations came from the rescued captive workers. Now recovering in medical facilities around the city, they recounted days spent inhaling chemical fumes under relentless production schedules, nights haunted by the sounds of armed guards pacing the steel corridors, weeks spent fearing that any mistake would end in silence. Their voices, fragile but steady, cut through the noise of scandal and politics. They reminded Chicago that this wasn't just a criminal operation, it was a human catastrophe hidden beneath their feet. Meanwhile, investigators waded through thousands of decrypted files from Steel Vale's server racks, shipment records mapping routes from Mexico to Chicago, names of corrupted city contractors, evidence of influence peddling, 3 encrypted documents referencing Phase 2, a planned expansion into Milwaukee, Detroit, and Indianapolis, using Mercer's regulatory changes as the foundation. The Congressman hadn't just enabled the cartel, he had designed a pipeline meant to reshape narcotics movement across the entire Great Lakes region. By the end of the 5th day, Chicago stood in a fog of anger and revelation. The skyline looked unchanged. The river still carried barges under the same bridges. The trains still rattled over steel rails. But the city itself felt pulled open, its hidden layers exposed. Mercer's empire was collapsing piece by piece, node by node, lie by lie. Los Serranos had lost its most valuable northern asset, and Chicago, battered but standing, was left to reckon with the truth that corruption does not always hide in alleys or shadows. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit, speaks at union halls, smiles on television, and asks for your vote. And sometimes it takes the full weight of a city, its people, its law enforcement, its will to survive, to bring that empire down. Crimson Sweep proved one thing beyond all doubt. Even the deepest, most carefully camouflaged criminal fortress can fall when the truth finally forces its way into the light.